Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. My name is Kriste Peoples, and I'm from Black Women's Alliance of Denver. And today it is my thrill to welcome Devi Ward Erickson. Now, Devi has a long list of amazing credentials, and I am going to share, but just a few that I know about. Devi is a Tantra expert. She is a sex coach, a sexologist, and she is the founder of the Institute of Authentic Tantra Education. She's also the host of a podcast that is called Sex is Medicine, and you got to check that out because it is fabulous. She's all about honoring sexuality as a sacred practice, and I am just going to welcome her in to tell us more about who she is and what's in store for us in this conversation. Welcome so much, Devi.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy. It's such a joy to be here with you.
Yeah. You know, Devi, the pleasure is mine for sure. I have taken so many notes. I have so many questions based on my own experience and my conversation with girlfriends about sex, about what's not satisfying, what it's all about, like how to just navigate in that space. So I'm excited to get to that. But first, I want to ask you, what is Tantra?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it really depends on who you ask. And it depends on the lineage and the orientation to practice. So in a nutshell, Tantra is an ancient spiritual science that began in India thousands and thousands of years ago. And in India, there were different teachers and different lineages and different approaches to the practice of Tantra. But basically, it's a set of tools and techniques and writings and scriptures that are all about how to live in balance and harmony with ourselves, with our planet, with our environment, and to realize our spiritual consciousness. And so about 2,600 years ago, when the Buddha happened, he was an Indian. He was an Indian, and he was trained in Indian-based Tantra at the time. And then he became realized, and he began teaching, and then his teachings became what we now call Tantric Buddhism. So in the realm of Tantra, I like to be very specific that I practice Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. There's Hindu Tantra, there's Shaivite Tantra, there's Shakti Tantra, there's all different styles of Tantra. And in the West, there's something called Neo-Tantra. And Neo-Tantra is kind of the Western distillation of the Indian practices. And Neo-Tantra is where you see a lot of the emphasis on sexuality. And that's a very important thing because as Westerners, we tend to be very fragmented and disconnected and dysfunctional when it comes to our sexuality. So that's a positive thing in that aspect. But a lot of Neo-Tantra doesn't contain the sacred teachings and the practices, like the core practices and the core motivation, which is how to live in harmony and balance and how to realize our ultimate consciousness. So whatever you want to call that, you want to call that God consciousness or Buddha consciousness or universal consciousness. But the whole point of Tantra is for us to be able to live in a state of bliss and connection and openness, joy and clarity, and treat each other with loving kindness and compassion. Like that's kind of the point. And in our teachings, we learn how to harness our sexuality and use it for that purpose. And that's where the sexual teachings come in. We view our sexual energy as a way to harness pleasure and tap into the powerful regenerative and healing aspects of pleasure and use it as a portal into these expanded states of consciousness.
Devi, that sounds so good.
Yeah.
I grew up in an experience that said, okay, sex is for marriage. And if you're pursuing sex or you're involved in sex or you're having sexual thoughts or there's anything going on in your body, it might be unholy.
Yeah.
Right? And on top of that, we've had the sort of demonization of the body, not, culturally in the bigger picture of this puritanical kind of, society that we're living in, but also as Black women, we've been sort of cast as animals and base and lesser than human, and I was going to say and also over sexualized, loose, and unattractive. I mean, there's so much that's layered on to our experience, or layered on, and they become barriers to a healthy sexual experience. How can we approach a sort of healthy expression of sexuality when there's so much to wade through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So everything that you're describing is what we refer to as trauma.
Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So there's intergenerational trauma, there's historical trauma, there's social traumas, there's racial traumas, there's personal traumas, religious traumas, all of that. And you're absolutely correct. The state of sexuality on this planet is deeply rooted in trauma. We are traumatized human beings, and particularly Black Americans carry the weight of this historical trauma that lives in our body. So the first thing to understand is, in my opinion, is exactly that. That number one, we have wounds, we have traumas, we have pains, we have burdens that we carry. And so what helps me, what that does, what that awareness helps me is have compassion for myself. That's number one. No matter what you're experiencing right now in terms of your sexuality, understand that you deserve compassion, you deserve love, you deserve kindness, you deserve joy, you deserve pleasure. And it's important to be aware that a lot of the stuff that gets layered on top of our brilliant, innocent nature is other people's crap. It's other people's stuff. And so a lot of the trauma that we carry, even though it lives in our bodies, it didn't necessarily come from us, right? It's not ours. The way society views Black women, that's not, we didn't make that up. That's
right.
not from us. That's their dysfunction. That's their insanity. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't change the situation, but in my mind, that kind of helps separate it. That there's nothing wrong with me, it's that there's something wrong with society. There's something deeply wrong with society, right? Yes. So that's number one. Number two is being mindful that this is a journey of self-love. So again, taking these small steps when we do want to embrace sexual healing and understand that that is what the journey is. The journey from being shut down to orgasmic ecstasy is a journey of healing. It's a journey of reclaiming our freedom. It's a journey of reclaiming our power and reclaiming our choice and reclaiming sovereignty over our own bodies and our own nervous system. And it is an ongoing, beautiful journey. There's not an end point in sight, quite frankly. And so being mindful that when we do have the courage, and it takes courage to begin investigating and stepping along the path, to move slowly, to move gently, to honor the messages of your body, to really tune in, because the only goal out of all of this is deep self-love and self-connection. That's the only goal. And all pleasure, all of the orgasm that we all crave and want, all of that arises naturally when we come home to our bodies.
Ooh, there's so much in there.
Yeah.
When I think about when I'm hearing you talk about, the orgasmic arrival, I'm thinking not just about sexually, which is wonderful, but I'm also thinking about universally, right? Because I find more and more on the spiritual path, there are parallels, if I can call them parallels, or maybe it's just, that one journey toward full realization, right? So if I feel more at home in my body, then I feel more confident, then that feels like its own sort of aphrodisiac or magnet for more love, joy, and fulfillment, right? And so I also feel that there is a hiccup along the way, if not a challenge or stumbling block, that comes in terms of, okay, worthiness or a sense of value or scarcity. The message that we're hearing, and that by we meaning myself personally and a lot of my women friends and acquaintances, there's a scarcity mentality that says, oh well, good men are hard to find, or a good partner, or satisfaction itself is almost unattainable. So how would you counsel us to really stay the course in that journey of fulfillment?
Yeah, I hear that.
It's easy to give up. The short version,
Yeah,
it's easy to give up.
it really is. There's a lot of reasons to give up. There's a lot of discouragement.
Yes.
So number one, our primary sexual relationship is the one that we have with ourselves.
Okay.
So I hear from a lot of women, they're waiting for Prince Charming to arise or arrive, right? And they're putting sexuality on, they're putting their sexual exploration and their sexual blossoming on hold until they find the right man. Well, I can tell you right now that the way to magnetize and draw in the right partner for you is for you to begin your own journey of sexual healing with yourself. And that's what we teach. That's what we focus on. Like, your best sexual healer is you. And it's and the most precious, profound reconnection that occurs is between me and my own body, is between you and your own body. That's where it starts. This is home, not out there. Here, the reclamation journey begins here. And as we begin to free ourselves from those culturally imposed prisons, those culturally imposed conditions on how much happiness, how much joy, how much satisfaction we're allowed to experience as human beings, particularly as Black women, how much we are worth, what our value is. We have to free ourselves from that crap.
Amen.
Those mental constraints, right? They're not real. And they're belief systems that are wired into our brain, literally on a physiological level. They're traumatized neural pathways. That's the way I think of them, as traumatized neural pathways. They can be they can be erased. They can be returned. Our self-love and self-connection can be restored. And so that's part of what we teach through the method of authentic Tantra. We teach how to come back home to the body and how to heal and release and break up and dissolve those traumatized neural pathways and replace them with a baseline of love. And when we heal the brain from trauma and we restore that baseline of love, everything in our worldview begins to change. And you're absolutely correct that what happens in the bedroom happens outside of the bedroom and vice versa. Our sexuality is not separate from our humanity. It is part of our totality. It's the whole picture. What's happening in one area is happening in every area. So it's about reuniting sexuality and our humanity and our spirituality. And when we are able to restore that and reestablish that, everything in our world changes. Our entire worldview changes. And instead of looking out of the world and seeing scarcity, we begin to look out in the world and see opportunities. I'm not waiting for Mr. Perfect to arrive because I know that there's no such thing as Mr. Perfect. But what I'm waiting for is a partner who can work with me, who I can grow with, we can grow together, and we can evolve together, and we can heal together, and we can heal each other. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And as you're speaking, one thing that comes up for me, I'm thinking about, as you're saying, restoring and returning to this place. I think about, coming into this world, we're innocent, and we also have that sort of overlay, coming into the culture and having these sort of restrictions and limitations kind of placed on us. And there's the ancestral stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so my question is, how do we make that return if we don't necessarily feel like, oh, back then I had a wide-eyed view of the possibility of myself. If I've never had that, is it a matter of continuing the practice, or in a sort of fake it till you make it kind of way? Is it about faith, or like what are the steps there? Because if I can't see it for myself, I'll speak personally because it's just me and you. Like if I don't see that, okay, my healthy sexuality and healing from all this ancestral pain, the cultural, my own disappointments and traumas, big they may be, like, how can I hold that vision in order to attract what I want? Because also, I tend to ask big questions. Bear with me.
I love it. It's great.
Because as I am putting my best intentions forward for divine right partner, I also feel like I'm going through a minefield of possible rejection or false starts and disappointments and ghosting and all that other business while I'm trying to put myself out there. So how do we hold the vision or keep the faith as we go? What do you suggest there?
Yeah. So there's a couple different questions in there. So the first thing that I want to say is when I say restoring or returning, I mean to our fundamental blueprint as human beings. You are absolutely correct that we have centuries of genetic trauma that we have to process. And in our communities, there's centuries of social trauma that we have to contend with. And so when I say restoring, I don't mean like some fairy tale. I mean restoring our basic core human blueprint, which is love. That is what all the trauma therapists and social psychologists, they all agree that the basic human blueprint is love. And so that's what I'm talking about. And that love is encoded into your DNA. It is encoded into your very essence. And so you're absolutely correct that we may have to dig through layers to return there. And it's not easy. I'm not going to lie. It's not easy. There is a burden that Black Americans carry that most people do not have to carry. There is a lot of genetic trauma that needs to be repaired, but it can be repaired. And Black Americans have tenacity, if nothing else.
That's right.
We're freaking survivors, right? We shall overcome, and we have overcome. So if anyone can do it, we can do it, right? So the important thing is finding the correct methods and the correct tools. Change we can't think ourselves into change. Having a different mindset is a great step in the right direction, but to actually change on a physical level, we have to be implementing methods and tools.
Yes.
Right? And so that's what Tantra is for me. Tantra is a set of yogic methods, breathing practices, physical practices, sexual practices, visualization and meditation practices that work on a cellular level to repair the damage done and restore the core blueprint of love. So that's number one. Because it's our core blueprint, we can return to it. It may take some digging, but we can do it, right? So there's that. In the midst of that, how do we keep our faith? It's faith, right? It's we got to give it up to a higher power. So whatever that is for you, I frequently make prayers and offerings to the Buddhas. You know, when I was practicing, when I had more of a Christian orientation, it was, I'm giving it up to God. I'm giving it up to spirit. So it's having the certainty and the faith and the power of our own prayer and sending up that as an offering to the universe and knowing that God loves us and hears us. And if we are doing our homework, we will get the reward.
Okay. And as you're saying, like offering it up to God or to a higher power, you know, I think about the division of like the spirit and the body, particularly in a Christian conservative, you know, upbringing or context, right? So what about the hurdles that I might encounter there? Because sometimes I feel like, okay, I can't bring anything about sexuality into this space of faith or belief or religion, because the two are supposed to be quite separate. How am I, right? Because there's a lot of trauma there.
That schism it's a deep trauma in the psychology of humanity around the world. And what comes up for me about that in Christianity is that is the legacy of colonialism. That did not start in Africa.
Right.
In fact, all sacred sexuality, all sacred practices began in Africa. I'm actually taking a class on the goddess, the roots of the historical roots of the goddess traditions. Everything came from Africa. And you see the symbolism throughout the world. And they worship the mother. They worship the sacredness of the body. They worship the celebration of sexuality. Those are our roots. So the current Christian values in that schism, that is a legacy of slavery. And it's not the truth. I'm just going to tell you, it's not the truth.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Oh, yes, that right there is hugely liberating, because that's the very much a short-sighted view. Religion says I can't have my body. Religion says I can't have sex. But
that's their religion. And they can keep that. We see what that does. It creates dysfunction. It creates dysfunction. It's not healthy.
And indeed, when we look, even if we look at the artwork, there's a lot of celebration and honoring of the body and fertility.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And our sexuality in these ancient traditions was understood to be just an aspect of our humanity. It's like, I make this analogy very often. Imagine, so we all need to eat food, right? Food is an appetite. It's a source of enrichment and nourishment. And if we don't eat for a period of time, we will literally die. So imagine if every time you were hungry, you were like, oh my God, I'm hungry. This must be the devil. Oh my God. And I feel so much shame. And then you like made your food and you ate in the closet as quickly as you could. And you didn't want to let anyone know ever that you ate food, right? That's the same as sex. Sex is an appetite. Sexual energy is a form of nourishment. Sexual pleasure is one of the healthiest things we can do for our body, our mind, our spirit. Sexual pleasure creates this cascade of hormones and nutrients in the body that are regenerative. It's good for your heart. Are you worried about your heart health? Have pleasure. It's good for the brain. It's good for the skin. It's good for the cells. It's good for the mood. It's good for the personality. It helps rewire those traumatized neural pathways in the brain. So your sexual pleasure is literally the portal. It's the gateway to life. There's a reason why they tell you to ignore it. There's a reason why they've taught you to fear it. There's a reason why they encourage you to disassociate from it, because it is your power source. When we are fully sexually integrated, we are in union with God. And we don't need somebody else to tell us how to get there, because we live it in our body. We live and breathe it. We feel it on a cellular level. That is our birthright. That is the truth.
Devi, tell me about your typical client. If there is a typical client, right? Because a lot of this is universal messaging, right? That you're sharing. And I'm curious about what point at which people come to you in their lives seeking sexual healing, because even as I recognize the tremendous value of this course of healing, I also don't know, when I would find myself reaching out. I don't think I would reach out to a sex therapist, a sexual healer, or a sex coach, just because, again, probably limited thinking or a limited belief system, or not feeling like, oh, okay, well, I got it. Everything else is working well in my life. I don't need a sex coach. Like, how do people arrive at your kind of training? What are they going through? What's happening?
Yeah, great question. So where I'm at now is different than where I started 12 years ago. So I've been in the industry for 12 years. And right now I focus on training practitioners. So we have the first ever government accredited school for tantric sexual healing in the world. And I just want to shout out that, of course, it's a woman of color who did that.
All right. Yes.
First in the world.
Fantastic. Yes. Congratulations. Wow.
Yeah. So my focus right now is training practitioners of this particular modality to go out into their communities and bring these healing techniques. So their clients and the clients that I worked with, when I first started 12 years ago, it really varies. Very often it's number one, there's a desire for more. It's like whatever we're experiencing, we want more. There's like a kind of an intuitive inherent sense that there's got to be more than this. Yeah, there's got to be more than this. And a yearning and a willingness and a readiness to dive in and to do what it takes. Because working with any of our coaches, it's not talk therapy. It's yoga. We're going to give you stuff to do. We're going to give you homework. We're going to teach you methods and practices, and we're going to give you all the tools you need to become your own healer. We're not going to heal for you. We're going to support you through that process, but it's up to you to implement the methods. So it's your journey. And through that comes your own empowerment and your own realization of like, hey, wow, look at this transformation that I catalyzed, that I cultivated. I did this. So it's a yearning for more. Very often there's an awareness that the previous traumas and pains and wounds are the obstacle to experiencing more. So looking for a way to dissolve or remove or eradicate the blocks, looking for a way to heal trauma. 1 in 4 women has experienced some form of sexual assault or sexual violence. 1 in 6 men, that's a lot, right? And that trauma, those wounds live in our bodies. The issues are literally in the tissues. And so being mindful that we have to go back to the body, we have to learn how to reattune to the messages of the body in order to fully heal and to fully repair. So those I'd say are some of the top 2, the desire for more and the recognition that what is blocking us from more is stuff that happened before that we're ready to clean up now. We're ready to address, and we have the capacity to address it now and move forward.
And, you know, when you speak of trauma, you know, I'm reminded that I've heard that women, we carry our strength in our hips, in our lower body, right? And so our self-defense classes and training teach us to fight more from below the waist with the leg. And I've also heard that we store a lot of our trauma in the hips and in the womb too. And on top of that, I was listening to one of your podcasts where you were talking about trauma and its release, and how, you know, someone, it might have been you, that you were saying that, you know, trauma comes in all different forms and experiences or levels of intensity. You said there was a guy who didn't call me back, and that landed as a trauma from way back in, or way back when, in addition to the very real, you know, violent nature of trauma that many, many women experience. Can you talk us through what it looks like to really be able to sit with trauma as it releases, or to recognize it even? No, this is very, very difficult work. And I think that also speaks to maybe why more of us aren't orienting toward that, because it is so huge.
Yeah, it is huge. So trauma is understood typically as any experience in which the nervous system perceives an overwhelming threat. Whether that threat is real or imagined, whether you're aware of it or not. And that's really important, because we're talking about the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which operates below the level of conscious awareness. We are not in conscious control of the autonomic nervous system. It's often people think of it as the automatic nervous system, right? It's just happening. It's the machinery in the background running stuff. And if the autonomic nervous system, it's wired for survival, and it's also wired for connection. And so if it perceives a threat, it will go into a defensive response, whether that's fight or flight or whether that's freeze. When we don't have the capacity to process that defensive reaction in the moment, it may, and in many cases does, store in the nervous system and in the body as a trauma response. So whether it's a freeze response or whether it's an undischarged fight or flight response, it gets stuck in the body. And we just push it away so that we can keep on trucking through life. We have to cope, right? And so you're exactly correct that there are obvious traumas like sexual assault or physical assault or domestic violence or that sort of thing, but there's a lot of micro traumas, and there's a lot of subtle traumas, and there's a lot of things that occur in our society that are considered normal that the nervous system will perceive as a trauma. So for instance, pap smears and pelvic exams and cervical exams very often are traumatizing, but we disassociate and disconnect and just kind of get through it and try to like think about other things, as opposed to being present in the body and remaining attuned and aware of what the responses are. Right? So that's an example of a normalized trauma that we're going to store in our body that is going to have the result of areas of numbness or pain or inability to orgasm, lack of sensation, all of those things, all of those are symptoms of a trauma response being stored in the body. So to answer your question of how do we begin to dissolve them? Well, there's a lot of resources, right? And it really, you know, I think of like, for me, like I hit it from all ends. So the beauty of sexual teachings in Tantra is they teach us how to use pleasure as lubricant. So
okay.
Like as like your double WD-40 to ease the experience of the release of some of those things that are held in the body. Because when the pleasure is really big, it absorbs your awareness. And so when some of these traumas release, they don't seem so overwhelming. It's easier to process. It's easier to, you focus on the pleasure and you're kind of like, oh, wow, how interesting. I didn't realize that was stuck there. Or there's grief or emotion that's arising and you have this grief and this emotion, but you have this amazing, overwhelming pleasure at the same time. So they're working in conjunction with each other and facilitating the release of whatever is stored there. That's the way we work with it sexually. And we do that. We do this process called translating pleasure. We cultivate pleasure in one area of the body and we take it and we touch another part of the body that's numb or in pain to reference that other area. Like, hey, you could feel like this here. If this is the pleasure and this is the pain, hey, pain, you could feel like this pleasure here. So we create this bridge between these two areas of the body. So the area of the body that's holding the pain or holding the numbness or holding the trauma is able to release it. And then I think of it as like it remembers its true nature. This place, it's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to feel like that. Let me get rid of this stuff holding me back and return. And that just happens somatically. Like that just happens on the level of the body, right? We don't have control over it other than to just generate pleasure and connect the dots. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it that is not sexually based, that's more just connection to our body, and I'm happy to share this exercise in more detail with everyone watching, is to make a somatic, a touch-based connection to the body. So putting one hand over the heart and one hand over the belly, and just breathing into the hand into your belly, and doing 10 deep breaths, holding, feeling in to this hand on the body or on the belly. And it helps us ground our awareness, bring our awareness back into the body. And if we start to feel any kind of distress in that moment, really orienting yourself sensually, meaning using our senses. So feeling the ground beneath your feet, feeling your bottom sitting on the chair, feeling the weight of that, feeling the clothes on your skin, looking around and really seeing what's happening in your environment. So we're anchoring our awareness into the here and the now, using the body as the anchor. And that helps reestablish that center. So when we have emotions or trauma arise, what can be scary is we'll relive the experience, right? And like, oh, these emotions are overwhelming and we don't want to feel them. So re-anchoring, recentering, so that we don't get lost, so that the emotion, the energy can discharge. It's important for it to release. You don't want to cap it back down. You don't want to stuff it back down. You want to just be like this vessel, this conduit, this column, this pillar of light, right? And let this stuff kind of dissipate and pass through, but stay anchored. And then when it passes, there's so much more space in the body. There's so much more richness and depth in our experience because we've released an obstacle to our ability to be fully present in the physical form. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Because
Yeah.
you said that, it made me think of an experience that I'd had where I had a relationship disappointment, and I was, and it was just, you know, I met someone, we had a great connection, and it, you know, that moment where it feels like, oh, I've known you for lifetimes, even though it's just been a moment. And then the following day, you know, after all that great rapport, I saw him again, and I realized he had a wedding ring on. And exactly. And I sat in my car. I sat in my car and I just cried to my girlfriend. I said, how could I not have seen that? And I just got carried away. I mean, at that moment of meeting, it was like whoosh, the it opened and the skies poured yellows. And just as intensely, the disappointment was there. And I cried. And this is for someone I hadn't known for not even 24 hours. But I feel like it touched that place that we're talking about, that place of grief or trauma of past disappointments. And it was ready to let go, because I said, wait a minute, I don't even know this man, but this is something very deep in me. So that grounding practice, had I had it at that time, would have been hugely stabilizing for me, because I didn't even know what was happening, because I was swept away by that intensity.
Yes.
And it can catch us unawares. So yes, it makes absolute sense.
Sorry, the puppy just got let back out.
Oh.
And tearing around the room.
Oh, that's wonderful. You know, this is like attracting all kind of energy to us today.
The dog's like, so yes, and you're exactly correct that when we, at this age, at this time of life, when we experience a wound, it's not like we're experiencing it for the first time. It's usually like the nth time, right? Or the umpteenth time. And sometimes it's hitting on genetic trauma, right? Or genetic, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be this reverberation. So the intensity of the emotion is not going to necessarily correlate to the event. And that's what you are expressing and experiencing. And even more importantly, that's why it's so important to allow the emotion to fully express, because it isn't just this moment. It's all 100 times that we've ever experienced that in this lifetime, and all the times our grandparents experienced it, and our grandparents experienced, and all of that. And so it's literally, I think of it as like as our cells weeping, like grieving on the cellular level.
Yes.
And we're very conditioned in this culture to avoid emotion, particularly painful emotions. We're afraid of them. We don't want to feel them. There must be something wrong. And yet, we're, as human beings, we're designed to experience a full range of emotions. For every happiness, there's a sadness. For every joy, there's a pain, right? And that's okay. What's important is that we maintain our center in all of it. And so exactly, having a way to ground into the center so that the whirlwind, the tornado of emotions can go, but you are anchored. And again, this is part of what we teach. It's one thing to think, oh, I want to be anchored. It's another thing to have a visceral experience of that, and to deepen and deepen and deepen and deepen. My anchor keeps going down and down and down and down. With every layer, it goes deeper, and it becomes stronger and more robust and more resilient.
Ooh, I love that. I love that, because for sure, I know that being swept away in those emotions, in that torrent, it takes a long time to come back. It's not necessarily coming back to center, but it's kind of, I weathered that storm. I got to do something to like build up my defenses against it. I'm a grown woman and I shouldn't be responding like a 14-year-old. And so that's another self-limitation, right?
Yeah.
You know, you have talked about having multiple tools and hitting it from all kinds of different directions. And I love this centering practice and the grounding meditations and all that. And I wonder, for those who are Well, in or outside of partnership, or we're looking to have more intimacy with ourselves, wherever, like, how can we communicate that desire in a way that feels safe
Mm-hmm.
within relationship and even with ourselves to, the self-talk that's
Mm-hmm.
it's safe to explore my body. It's safe to have. It's safe to cry and be vulnerable and let go
Mm-hmm.
pain that I don't even know where it came from, but it's okay to be here in this space.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a couple things. So one, in my opinion, it's really vital to have the support of a mentor or a coach or a guide,
Okay.
because healing happens best in relationship. And it doesn't, and that can be a romantic relationship if your partner is equipped for that. It can be a professional relationship, it can be a friendship, that sort of thing. But we need each other to remember who we truly are, right? And we
Mm-hmm.
need each other for feedback, and we need each other for guidance. And so when you decide, if you do decide to embark on the journey of sexual healing, finding resources that you can trust is really important. And so for me, so I wrote a book called Shake Your Soul Song. And so some of the people that come my way currently now in the training program, or find some of our graduates, their first step was reading my book. Right? That was their first
Mm-hmm.
kind of dipping their toe in the water of this sexual self-exploration. Like, I'm going to read about this journey. I'm going to see what's possible. And in my book, I give methods and tools, and they try some of them and they get results. And they realize at some point that, hey, I actually want to dive in more fully and more deeply. So I need help. And that's when they start looking for a reliable coach or a reliable guide through this process. Because ultimately, in my opinion, we really need someone who has walked the path and gotten through
Mm-hmm.
it into the other side and can show you the way. And I'll give you an example of why this is so important. One of my students a couple years ago, I gave her this pleasure practice. We call it the orgasmic awareness practice, right? And the goal of it is not orgasm. The goal of it is just cultivating pleasure and connection with your body, right? And so she went and she did this practice, and she called me or texted me, and she's like, I failed miserably. It was the most awful, blah, blah, blah. You're going to, I'm going to fail, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, well, tell me what happened. And she said, well, I laid down, I put my heart over my hand over my heart and my hand over my genitals. And I just started crying. And like, I couldn't get any pleasure. Like, I didn't even want to touch myself, but I just laid there and I cried. And I was like, you get an A+. That's perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's thinking that she failed the exercise. But from my point of view, because I've done this and I've been there and I have the expertise and the training, I see that I'm like, how wonderful. You took the first step in healing. Now let's see what happens when you go back and do it again, because you cleared that layer off. What's underneath that? So that's why guidance is so important, because you're right. We do get caught in our own mind traps, right? We do get caught in our own, in an uninformed and culturally conditioned views about what sex and pleasure should look like. There's no should around this. This is your journey. And everything that arises is a beautiful expression of your body sharing its wisdom with you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the
Oh,
importance of having a guide and a coach. So there's that. How to communicate with your partner about this journey. If you are in partnership and you're like, hey, I want to like embark on this deepening and this healing. I want to learn how to, heal each other and experience more pleasure and passion. That really has a lot to do with who you're in partnership with. So let's presume that you are in partnership with someone who has your best interest at heart, who wants the best for you, just like you want the best for them. That's going to be potentially a fun and an easier conversation to have, because you're both invested in each other's well-being. Hey, I have trauma that I want to heal, and I want you as my partner to participate in this journey with me. Would you be willing to do that so that we can have even more love? Right? That's what we're going for. So if that's the kind of relationship that we find ourselves in, that is amazing. And that's, we communicate it based on what it's going to bring to both of us. It's going to enrich our relationship. If we're in partnership that we don't have each other's best interest at heart, that's a more challenging journey. And what I've seen when I've worked with women or men who are in relationship with partners, and it's not a correct match for them. Maybe it was at some point, but now it's not. And one partner wants to grow and is committed to growing, and the other person isn't interested, the relationship will dissolve.
You know, I'm curious about what men are asking for when they come to you, or when they come to the coaches that you've trained, right? And not even necessarily in a heterosexual sense, but just in terms of, you know, what we're each looking for. Because if we think of, yeah, what
What are they looking for?
yeah, I'm curious about men in general. So
yeah, I love working. I love working with human beings. So regardless of what your genital makeup happens to be, so the top two items that men are coming to us for it, and I do want to say that generally they are heterosexual and they are cisgendered men coming to us. Number one, they're looking for ejaculatory control. They want to have control and choice over their ejaculatory response. The average time of sexual penetration is 2 to 7 minutes. And yet it can take a woman's body 20 to 45 minutes to be fully engorged. So women have as much erectile tissue internally as a man has externally. In fact, we've got more, but it takes us 20 to 45 minutes to get an erection, right? So if you juxtapose that with the fact that most men pop off in 2 to 7 minutes, and it takes us 20 to 45 minutes for us to even be ready to have internal orgasms, that's a huge discrepancy. And men are aware of that, and they feel a lot of shame about it, and they've never been taught how to have choice over their ejaculatory control. In fact, it's actually disencouraged in the society through pornography and media and that sort of thing. So the first thing they want to learn is how to last. And they want to have choice, and they want to become multi-orgasmic. They're like, wait a minute, if I can have multiple orgasms, why wouldn't I want that too? Right? So that's number one. Number two, they want to learn how to pleasure their partners, period. They want to learn how to show up for their partners. They want to learn female anatomy. They want to learn how to bring pleasure, and they want to learn how to heal their partners. It is the most beautiful thing, because there's this myth that women are the ones who want healing and men don't. Total myth. In my work with couples, I would have to say 90% of the time when I've worked with couples throughout these 12 years, it's the men who reach out. 90% of the time, it's the men who reach out, because they love their female partners, and they know that they're not able to bring them the sexual pleasure that they want, and they want to know how to do that. They want to know how to connect more intimately and more fully and more deeply. They want to know how to light their woman's life up. And it's them reaching out, asking for support. 90% of the time, I kid you not.
That's so good to hear.
Isn't that amazing and beautiful?
It is amazing, because I don't know those men, but I'm happy they exist. And, you know, as you're talking about our training, or, you know, the men didn't have experience. We don't typically have it either. Nobody is getting good education on sex. And, you know, years ago when I was in college, I was in I performed in the vagina monologues. And it was the first time that I realized, oh my gosh, I don't really talk to my girlfriends deeply about their experiences with their vaginas or sex. It's just something that we kind of tend to take on from, you know, a few, you know, maybe mediocre or bad experiences, and we kind of build on that, or TV or whatever. Like, where does the healthy education come from? And I want to ask you this too. In our conversations that are centered around this healing in relationships, so if I am talking to a close girlfriend, I want to share this journey with her, how can we broach that topic of, hey, I'm on this journey of sexual healing, I just want to kind of bounce some things off of you, so to speak, and about it, and, you know, in a safe way. How can we create a container of safety to have these conversations about our journeys?
Yeah.
in our friendships?
Those are great questions. And you're absolutely correct that there is a deficit of resources for healthy sexual connection. And again, if we look at the puritanical roots of our culture and the legacy of colonialism, I mean, that's all part of it. That is part, the reverberation of that throughout the centuries has left us here today with no resources for how to have healthy human connection with our bodies and with each other. And there's no rites of passage for women and men. I mean, girls, they get a box of tampons and, you know, you're going to bleed once a month, and guys get porn. Right. And so there is no in-depth, there are very few resources for in-depth, loving, healthy, open, authentic conversations about pleasure and sexuality, pleasure-based sex education. That is changing. They have it in Europe, right? And it's starting to change in increments. And that's why we started a school. That's why I wanted to have a government accredited school, so that I could train people to go out in the world and teach our communities about this, because this is our birthright. So there are resources that are starting now, and in 5, 10, 20 years, they'll be more widely accessible. So we are at the beginning, the arrow spear of this change, this transformation, number one. Number two, to answer your second question of how do we create this safe space to talk about it? Well, being mindful again that we're carrying all of our baggage into every situation, all of our previous traumas. There are going to be some of your girlfriends who feel comfortable having these conversations. There's going to be other girlfriends who are going to be deeply triggered because of their own pain and their own trauma that they aren't quite ready to process or address. So discernment comes in, right? Discernment, and maybe putting out a few feelers here and there, or just being bold, like putting it up like you did for Black Women's Alliance. Like, hey, I want to have these conversations about healthy sexuality and using pleasure to heal. Who's in? Who wants to do this? And then the one resource that I can think of, because I created it for this, was my book, Shake Your Soul Song. I wrote the book with the intention that women would create women's circles and go through, do like a book study together, go through the books and have meetings once a week or once a month to talk about your experience and your practices. And there's journaling exercises and solo sexuals, pleasure practices. So I wrote a book to do exactly that. So that's what I wrote, but there's probably other resources as well. I just haven't investigated. So do some research, find out, what are the resources that are out there? Because there's a lot of incredible Black women in the field of sexuality and healing who've written incredible books and are offering incredible teachings. So finding people, coaches, authors that you resonate with, who speak to your soul, and then creating a group around it, a group of people who are dedicated and committed and excited about going on this journey together.
Okay.
Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yes. And there's so much information in everything that you're sharing. I'm like making mental notes to reach out for these resources. I want to know, before we go, what was your journey here to get to where you are? How did you become Devi Ward Erickson?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I almost died. So I come from a history of deep trauma. So I grew up in a home of domestic violence. Watched my father almost kill my mom on several occasions. My father almost killed me when I was 13. Not exaggerating. I had sexual abuse trauma from when I was little, and then, you know, growing up in this culture, lots of racial trauma, assaults when I was a young woman in my 19, 20-year-old type of thing. So, and at the time I had no concept of trauma. I just thought I was crazy. I didn't understand that I was actually profoundly traumatized. I had post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't know that. And so when I was 19 or 20, I sat down one night with a bottle of wine and a razor blade and decided to kill myself. And I have the scars on my wrist to prove it. Luckily, I did not take that final cut. But that was my bottom. That was my deepest anguish and my deepest despair. And I was in so much pain that I was not willing to live another day. Luckily, I did, though, made the choice to continue living. And so from there, I dedicated myself to finding a way to live on this planet and in this body free of pain. Not physical pain, but emotional pain. My emotional pain was so overwhelming, I could barely breathe. It was excruciating. And I knew that after that experience, I was not willing to die. That was always my plan B. So I knew I wasn't willing to die, so I had to find a way to live. And so for me, my journey was about spirituality. It was, how do I reclaim, how do I feel God's love again? How do I reconnect with myself and with love and feel peace? I wanted inner peace. That's what I wanted. So I started exploring. I started studying herbalism. I learned Reiki. I became certified in Reiki, crystal healing, candle magic. I tried every alternative therapy there possibly was. I was a raw foodist. I fasted. I didn't eat for 40 days. I mean, I did all kinds of stuff to try to dissolve the suffering and replace it with peace and harmony. And I ended up encountering a spiritual practice called the Ashaya's Ascension. And I became a monk at the age of 24. I dedicated my life to spiritual realization and being a conduit for God, for the wisdom to share that. And so I wore only white, I received the name Devi, I took vows, all that stuff. And I was out in the world as a meditation instructor for years. Then I moved to Hawaii.
For how many? For how many years you froze up?
I was a monk. I was technically a monk for 9 years. I was actively teaching back and forth for about 4 to 5 of those years. Yeah. So I was teaching, and then I would have other work and teaching and other work, that sort of thing. So I was, but I was officially a monk of this tradition for 9 years. And it was a tradition that allowed us to be out in the world. So we had an ashram in North Carolina that we trained at and studied at. And then once we completed our training, they kind of kicked us out of the nest and said, go forth and spread the teaching. So that's what I was doing. And then when I moved to Kauai, Hawaii, I encountered Tantric Buddhism, and through these sexual teachings specifically. So my mentor at the time, he was also a natural health practitioner, and he was working with me on resolving some physical health issues. And at the end of our professional work together, after about 6 months, and throughout the 6 months, he would talk about, sexual tantra and tantric Buddhism, and it kind of went in one ear and out the other, because I wasn't really interested in sex at the time. That wasn't my focus. I was interested in God and spirituality, and I didn't really understand how the two intersected. I intuited that there was a connection, but I didn't intellectually understand it. And so when our professional relationship ended, he invited me to train with him formally in this Tibetan, in these ancient Tibetan sexual teachings that were used as a path to realization. And because it was the realization part that hooked me. Because if he had just said, like, have better sex and orgasms, I would have been like, no, thank you, I'm fine, right? But it was lineage-based ancient instructions and literally how to harness our sexual energy and use it for the transformation of consciousness. And because I had tried everything else except for the sex, I was curious to see what happened if I addressed the sex. And it was the complete opposite of what I expected. I thought it was going to be like floating in the clouds in these like bliss realms. It brought me face first into my deepest trauma and my deepest wounding. And I healed from the bottom up. I healed literally from the inside out. And it was because of the depth and the profundity of the healing that I committed my life to sharing these teachings with the world. Because I probably would have been dead. Honestly, I mean, I wasn't at the point where I was suicidal, but I was unable to function fully in the world. I was crippled by all of that unresolved trauma. My relationships were awful. My personal interactions were awful. My body had all these weird illnesses that the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. And it was through doing these practices, and particularly the piece of integrating my sexuality with my spiritual practice, that liberated me literally on a cellular level and continues to this day. So I did not start out like this. I started out like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how I started. And it was layer by layer by layer by layer, peeling away all this lineage of pain, this lifetime of pain that I carried in my body that has freed me and allowed me to be who and what I am today. And it takes courage and practice and patience and a tremendous amount of self-compassion and self-love.
Devi Ward Erickson, you are a jewel. I mean, you have shared so much insight, wisdom, and just deep, raw truth. I know I'm going to keep coming back to this to just learn and unpack so much of what you shared. And I would like to ask you before we go, because there's so much that we did not talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want women to know that we haven't touched on? Is there a practice or a piece of information that you would like to share? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I guess, the thought I'll leave us with is that our potential is so vast. We are God incarnate. We are the divine in physical form. And the reason that we don't have access to that as a lived embodied experience that we live and breathe in every moment is because of other people's crap. It's because of other people's burdens that we carry. And the path to liberation is through our own bodies. So restoring your birthright to pleasure and connection and orgasmic expression is a revolutionary act.
Mm.
It's a political act to reclaim your pleasure, because we are reclaiming our bodies from the patriarchy, and we are reclaiming our bodies from the repercussions of colonialism. It is a reclamation.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes, Davy. Yes. Okay. I want to thank, yes, our honored teacher, and thank you everybody for joining us for this moving conversation with Devi Ward Erickson. We will see you next time, everyone.
Yes, blessings.